Welcome to Creepy Mysteries. Before moving to the story, I just want to take a moment. Every story here is crafted to take you on a spine-chilling journey. If you enjoy what you hear and want more tales of the unknown, consider subscribing to the channel. It truly means the world to us. And if this story intrigued you, let us know by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us uncover even more mysteries to share with you. Now let's move on to the story. Have you ever driven down a stretch of highway so desolate it felt like the world was miles away? Well, I did, and it was on a lonely night, on a road I'd traveled countless times before, that I encountered something I'll never forget. I used to drive trucks for a living, hauling goods through some of the most isolated roads in Texas. But what happened on that highway still haunts me to this day. This is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Highway 287, and how I picked up something I couldn't explain and never expected to see again. I used to drive truck for a living, long hauls through the dead of night on the desolate highways that cut through Texas. Most nights it was just me, the open road and the hum of the engine. But one night something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was around 2 a.m. when I was driving down Highway 287, a stretch of road known for being lonely and isolated. The headlights barely lit up the path ahead, and the only sound I could hear was the drone of the engine and the occasional wind howling across the barren landscape. That's when I saw her. Out of nowhere, a woman appeared on the side of the road. I almost missed her if it weren't for the fact that she was standing there, dressed in a dirty white dress, almost glowing under the dim streetlight. She looked like she'd been standing there for hours, just waiting. I slowed down and rolled the window down, despite the chill that swept through the truck. She had this strange look on her face, eyes sunken and tired, but there was a look of desperation in them. It wasn't the usual hitchhiker. Something about her didn't feel right. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked at me for a second, her eyes scanning the truck before she slowly nodded. "Please, I need to get home." I could tell she wasn't from around here. Her accent sounded unfamiliar, and there was an odd air about her. But I figured she was just another stranded soul, desperate for help. So I unlocked the door, and she climbed in. As soon as she sat down, a strange chill filled the cab. The air felt heavier, and I could tell she was shivering, but her face remained eerily calm. She didn't say much, just stared out the window, her expression unreadable. I tried making small talk, but every question I asked seemed to fall flat. She barely responded, just offering small, almost unintelligible answers. The silence between us was thick, and it made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. We were driving for about 15 minutes, the only sound being the tires humming against the road. I looked over at her and noticed her reflection in the mirror. For a second, it looked like she wasn't even there, just a shadow. I shook my head, telling myself it was just exhaustion setting in. I hadn't had much sleep the past few days, so I kept focusing on the road ahead. Then out of nowhere, I looked in the rearview mirror and realized she was gone. I slammed on the brakes, swerving a bit but managing to regain control of the truck. I looked around the cab, my heart racing. There was no sign of her. The seat beside me was empty. "Shit," I muttered, looking in every direction. I pulled over to the shoulder and grabbed my flashlight, scanning the dark road behind me. There was nothing. No sign of a woman walking, no other vehicles in sight. It was as if she'd completely vanished. I couldn't make sense of it. The road was straight, flat, and there was no way she could have just disappeared like that. I checked my truck, my mind spinning. Nothing. Not a trace of her anywhere. I tried to shake it off as a hallucination, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I kept thinking about her face, those cold, vacant eyes staring out the window. I had this feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone in the truck. The next morning, I was in a small diner in the middle of nowhere, grabbing a cup of coffee before I hit the road again. I casually mentioned to the waitress about the hitchhiker I picked up on Highway 287. She looked at me like I was crazy. "You didn't hear?" she said, shaking her head. "That stretch of road's haunted. There's been stories for years about a woman who appears on the side of the road late at night asking for a ride. But she's been dead for over 20 years. She died in a car crash right near that spot. Her ghost is said to be out there, waiting for someone to pick her up. And if you do, she disappears. Always. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just some small town legend. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized maybe there was some truth to it. I've driven that stretch of highway 100 times since, but I've never seen her again. Still, every time I pass that spot, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. And when I look in the rearview mirror, I always half expect to see her sitting there, just waiting for her next ride. It was supposed to be just another job. I was hired by a company to help clear out an old ranch in West Texas, a place that had been abandoned for years. The owner had passed away, and they wanted to sell the property, but there was a lot of old junk to clear out before that could happen. Nothing too out of the ordinary. The ranch was miles away from any other property, deep in the West Texas wilderness, the kind of place you only find if you're really looking for it. I should have known something was off the moment I pulled up to the gate. The place had an unsettling silence, as if nature itself had decided to stay away. There were no animals, no birds, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. I parked my truck and got out, feeling a strange unease crawl up my spine. The house was a rundown, decrepit two-story building. There was a barn to the left, barely standing, with boards hanging off it like it was being slowly devoured by the land itself. But what really struck me was the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like someone or something was watching me. I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves. I'd worked in abandoned places before. It was usually just my imagination running wild. But as I started walking up to the house, I saw something strange on the ground. There were old, faded footprints in the dirt leading to the front door. Barefoot, like someone had been walking around out here recently. It didn't make sense. The ranch had been abandoned for years. Still, I went inside, telling myself that it was probably just an animal or some wandering drifters. The air inside the house smelled stale, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. There were old pieces of furniture covered in dust, old photos on the walls, and stacks of newspapers from decades ago. It looked like the house hadn't been touched in ages, but as I started clearing out the old boxes in the living room, I heard something. Footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps, just outside the room. I froze. I wasn't alone. My first thought was maybe it was another worker, or maybe even someone who had broken in. But then I remembered. I was the only one scheduled to work there today. I slowly walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I opened it, there was nothing there. Just empty hallways and dust. But the footsteps, they hadn't stopped. They were getting closer. I began to feel a deep, heavy presence behind me, like someone was breathing down my neck. But when I turned around, the room was still empty. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears, but I had to finish the job. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. Then I found something in the back of the house, something that changed everything. Behind a false wall in the basement, I uncovered an old rusted door. It wasn't locked, but the moment I touched it, a chill ran through me. As I opened it, I stumbled upon a room that looked like it hadn't been touched for decades. There were old furniture pieces, but in the corner was a chair, a wooden chair that seemed out of place, positioned perfectly in the center of the room, facing the wall. I stepped closer and noticed something even more disturbing. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. And in the center of the room, on the floor, was a large pentagram, etched deeply into the stone. That's when I heard the voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but there was no one there. The door slammed shut behind me, and the room felt like it was closing in. My breath quickened. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and I could hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, but this time, they were all around me. I could feel the presence. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in the walls, in the air. It was everywhere. And then I heard something that sent a wave of ice through my veins. The chair, it moved. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I bolted for the door, and this time it opened. I ran through the house, heart racing, the whispers getting louder and louder, until I finally burst through the front door and into the daylight. But as I was leaving, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. In the upstairs window of the house, there was a figure standing there, watching me. No one had lived there for years. That was the last time I ever set foot on that ranch. The company later told me that they'd received complaints about strange occurrences and sightings around the property for years. They never warned me, but after that experience, I knew I'd never be able to forget what I saw in that cursed house. As I tell this story, I still feel the cold creeping into my bones whenever I think about that place. But the worst part? When I checked the map after leaving, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The ranch I was working at no longer existed. It wasn't on the map. The property, the land, everything had been marked as abandoned for decades, long before the company ever hired me. So what did I really find there? Was it a ghost of the past or something far darker? I've never gone back to West Texas since, and every time I drive through, I can't help but feel that someone's still watching me. It was late one Friday night when I was driving home from a long day of work. I was on a stretch of road I'd driven hundreds of times before, Route 63, a two-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. The kind of road that, if you blinked, you'd miss it. The kind of road where you don't see a single car for miles. The headlights of my truck pierced the pitch-black darkness. But even with the road in front of me lit up, something about that night felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the emptiness of the road, the dead quiet of the night, it all just felt too eerie. I was almost halfway to my destination when I saw something strange in the distance, at the edge of the road. A figure. It wasn't a person walking. It was more like a shadow standing still just off the shoulder. I slowed down as I got closer, squinting to try and make out what it was. It wasn't until I was almost right on top of it that I realized what I was seeing. It was a person standing there, dressed in all black, with their back turned toward me. No lights, no reflection, just a figure in the middle of nowhere. I almost didn't stop. I mean, this was a highway with no other cars around, and I didn't think anyone would be out here this late, but something in me told me to pull over. I figured maybe they needed help, maybe they had broken down, or were hitchhiking. I rolled down my window as I pulled up beside them. I could feel the wind howling outside, the truck engine idling loudly, but there was still an eerie silence around this figure. "Hey, you need a ride?" I called out. No response. I leaned out the window a little, trying to get a better look. The figure was still completely motionless, facing away from me. "Hey!" I shouted again, but they didn't even flinch. At this point, I was starting to get a little freaked out. It was like they were either deaf or completely unaware of the world around them. I reached over and honked the horn once, loudly hoping to get their attention, but there was nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement. Finally, I made a decision. I was going to drive off. As I started to pull away, I glanced in my rearview mirror to see if the person had turned around, maybe to wave me off or something. But what I saw in the mirror made my heart drop. The figure was standing directly in the middle of the road now, facing me, but still, there was no movement. The thing that made it worse was the shadow. It wasn't the kind of shadow you'd expect from someone standing under streetlights. This one was completely dark, like it was made of pure blackness, almost as if it had a presence all of its own. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road, my heart racing. But as I looked back in my mirror again, the figure was still there, still standing in the same spot, and it was following me. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, that I was seeing things. But as I drove faster and faster, I could feel it. The shadow was moving with me, matching my speed as if it were attached to the truck itself. No matter how fast I went, the figure was always right there behind me in the mirror, just standing, not moving, like it was stalking me. I don't know how long I kept driving like that, but I kept checking my mirrors and the shadow never left. Eventually, I pulled over, hoping the figure would go away. I waited for what felt like forever, just staring at the road, the only light coming from the truck's headlights. Finally, I got the nerve to get out. I had to know what this thing was. I turned to look behind me one last time. The shadow was gone. There was nothing on the road, no trace of anyone standing there. I walked a few feet forward, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something still lurking, hidden just beyond my sight. I got back in the truck and drove home, but from that day on, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was always watching me when I was on that road. I never took Route 63 again. It wasn't until a few months later, when I was talking to a friend who worked in a nearby town, that I heard something that made my blood run cold. She told me about an old urban legend of the area. Apparently, there had been a story about a shadowy figure that stalked that very highway for decades. They said it wasn't just some random ghost, it was a creature, something that had been seen by countless people over the years. People who tried to help, tried to stop for the figure, only to end up seeing the shadow follow them until they reached home. And the worst part? The people who saw the figure, who stopped, or even interacted with it, were never seen again. They disappeared. Every single one of them just vanished without a trace. Now, whenever I drive at night, I keep my eyes on the road. I can't help but wonder if that shadow is still out there, still waiting to catch the next person who dares to stop. That's for today from Creepy Mysteries. Hope you enjoyed the stories. If you enjoyed the stories and want more tales that send chills down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, the scariest stories are often the ones that feel a little too real. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.